Okay, picture this with me for a second. A student in a city like Hyderabad, maybe they've just finished their engineering degree. Their bags are packed, their dreams are stretching as high as the Charminar itself.
Mm.
They have that acceptance letter from a top university in the US, passport in hand, ready for groundbreaking research, maybe even that dream job waiting down the line in Silicon Valley. It feels like the future is wide open.
Yeah, the classic path, right?
Exactly. But then, almost overnight, the door just slams shut. Uncle Sam, who they thought was rolling out the welcome mat, is suddenly acting like a really tough bouncer,
Move.
and all those massive aspirations just shrouded in uncertainty.
That image is so powerful because it cuts right to the heart of what we've been exploring. We've taken a look at a stack of source material that really zeroes in on a major policy shift happening right now in the United States.
Mhm.
It's fundamentally changing who gets to come into the country. And it's turning what used to be a fairly clear, if competitive, path for people from places like India into something that feels incredibly uncertain, maybe even like a dead end for some.
It really does feel less like a welcome sign and more like the drawbridge being pulled up, doesn't it? Our deep dive into these sources focuses heavily on recent changes, particularly under a returned administration, and how those changes are sending genuine shockwaves across the globe.
Absolutely. And what's particularly fascinating about the sources we explored is how they go beyond just stating the policy. They really dig into the stated reasons behind these changes, then look critically at the actual impact on real people and families.
Right.
And finally, they offer a perspective on what the bigger strategic goal might be driving all of this.
So our mission today is to essentially be your guides through that source material.
Mhm.
We want to unpack everything we found, the why according to the official narrative, the why according to the source's analysis, the tangible impact we saw described, and what it all ultimately means.
Yeah, cutting through the noise.
Exactly.
That.
Getting to those core insights together.
And the sources we've examined provide a really critical lens on the official story, challenging some of the justifications and highlighting the very real human and economic stakes involved in this policy shift.
All right, let's jump in. The source material describes a pretty significant action right off the bat: the use of executive power to make entering the U.S. much more difficult. It paints a picture of the U.S. effectively presenting itself as a fortress.
That's the imagery the sources use,
Mm.
and the justifications we saw cited for this move. Honestly, they sound like they're ripped straight from a political thriller.
Like what?
Well, the administration, according to the material, is pointing fingers at rampant anti-Semitism, vaguely defined anti-national activities, and even outright espionage, supposedly happening on U.S. campuses.
Espionage on college campuses. I mean, when I hear that, I picture spies in trench coats trying to steal nuclear codes from a physics lab. But the source material we looked at pushes back on this pretty hard, right?
It really does. The source describes the evidence presented for these kinds of claims as shakier than a Jenga tower in an earthquake. It raises a really important question. Is this espionage they're talking about actually happening in university libraries or chemistry labs?
Mm-hmm.
Or is that term being used to sweep in things like participating in campus protests? The source suggests the latter is much closer to what's happening, heavily questioning the extent of actual espionage being conducted by students.
So if the stated reasons feel a bit theatrical, let's say, what does the source material suggest is the deeper game being played here?
When we connect this action to the broader context presented in our sources, the deeper goal appears quite clear:
Mm.
a deliberate effort to significantly reduce immigration overall.
Overall, not just targeting specific groups.
That seems to be the implication. And that's both people attempting to cross borders illegally and those coming through established legal channels.
That's a crucial distinction the source highlights, isn't it? Because on one hand, you have incredibly vulnerable people making perilous journeys across deserts, and on the other, you have students arriving legally with valid visas, ready to enroll and contribute.
Exactly. And legal immigration isn't some tiny side stream. The sources emphasize it's the bulk of the inflow. We saw key statistics pointing out that legal immigration accounts for roughly 77% of the total immigrant flow into the U.S.
77%.
Yeah, and Indian students are an absolutely massive part of that story. We're talking about over 200,000 Indian students enrolled in U.S. universities just in 2023.
Wow.
And their contribution, a staggering $9 billion to the U.S. economy.
$9 billion. That's not pocket change. But the source suggests that this nuance, the legal paths, the economic boost, is just completely ignored in the messaging around this policy.
That's the source's take. They argue the message being relentlessly pushed is a very simple one. America's too full. All the complexity, the massive economic benefits, the established legal pathways, they seem to be disregarded in favor of a blunt, unwelcoming message. The welcome mat is gone.
Now, let's really focus on where this is being felt most acutely right now, according to our sources. India. For so long, the U.S. has been painted as the holy grail for Indian students.
Without a doubt. The allure has always been those world-renowned universities, the opportunity to be at the forefront of research, and access to a job market that, as the source puts it, doesn't make you feel like you're in the Hunger Games.
Yeah.
For generations, getting a degree from a place like MIT or Stanford wasn't just education. It was widely seen as this golden key, a key that could unlock a great tech job, a green card, and eventually that classic image of the house with a white picket fence.
But the source material shows us how these new rules are essentially taking that golden key and turning it into little more than a paperweight for so many hopefuls.
That's the stark reality described in the sources. We're seeing visa refusals spiking dramatically. Students are getting rejection letters back incredibly fast. Faster, one source joked, than you can say H-1B.
And just quickly, H-1B, that's the skilled worker visa a lot of these students aim for after graduation, right? Especially in tech.
Exactly. It's the main pathway. So hitting the student visa stage hits that future prospect too. Then you have students already midway through their degrees suddenly worried about being yanked out.
Mid-course, wow.
Yeah, and those still back in India are facing significant delays or outright denials when they apply. It's creating chaos at every stage.
And then there's this incredibly visual, almost theatrical deportation drama that the source material details. It describes a small group of students, fewer than 20, our sources note, and most were actually undocumented, not current visa holders.
Right, that's an important clarification.
Being handcuffed, put on a military plane, and flown thousands of miles back to Punjab.
The source doesn't shy away from calling it a spectacle. And the analysis suggests the purpose wasn't just the act itself, given the small numbers, but the optics. It was designed to send a powerful, incredibly harsh message. America's not your playground anymore.
You can only imagine the panic and fallout from that, especially back in India. The source material really drives home the impact on families who have made immense sacrifices, taking out huge loans, selling land, draining their life savings.
It's created ripple effects across the country. We saw descriptions of Hyderabad coaching centers, the ones specifically geared towards prepping students for U.S. college admissions tests, seeing a noticeable drop in enrollment.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Parents in places like Chennai are suddenly Googling Canada study visa with a real sense of urgency. And the mood in smaller towns and villages, where a U.S. degree was often the ultimate symbol of success and a pathway for the whole family, is described as incredibly grim.
Just devastating for them.
We even came across a quote from a parent in Gujarat in the material we reviewed, and it just hits you. We thought America was the future. Now it feels like a trap.
Wow. That quote, it really encapsulates the heartbreak. Okay, let's pivot slightly and use the sources analysis to fact-check some of these very serious claims being made. What do the actual numbers and details reveal when we look closer?
That's what our sources do so well. They dig into the data. On the visa numbers, yes, there is a definite dip for Indian student visa approvals. The material showed that in the first quarter of 2025, the approval rate for Indians was around 60%, down from 75% in 2023.
Okay, so a 15% drop, that's significant.
It is. So it's not a total chokehold stopping everyone, but the source accurately terms it a significant squeeze. And yes, the analogy they used was that getting a visa now is harder than getting a front row seat at a Diljit Dosanjh concert.
Okay, so a squeeze is real. But what about this espionage claim? Does the source material find any actual beef there? Any substance?
On the espionage claim, the source material finds it distinctly lacking in substance. While they acknowledge a 2024 FBI report did raise concerns about intellectual property theft. Things like stealing trade secrets or patented designs.
Sure, IP theft is a real thing.
It is. But the sources are quick to point out that only a tiny fraction of those cases actually involve students. The overwhelming majority were linked to the state-sponsored actors, not individual students sitting in dorm rooms.
So blaming the students is misleading.
The source pretty definitively calls the espionage claim a smokescreen.
A smokescreen, okay. And the anti-Semitism claim, where does the source land on that?
The source describes that one as murkier. It's clearly connected to the significant increase in campus protests related to U.S. foreign policy, particularly concerning Gaza.
Right, those have been very visible.
Very. But the sources question the rationale of specifically pinning this issue on Indian students, calling it like blaming samosas for a bad curry. They note there aren't any major reports they could find that significantly tie Indian students to these specific issues in large numbers.
So the link feels tenuous, according to the analysis.
Very tenuous based on what we reviewed.
And the deportations, that Punjab plane incident, was that primarily about optics, as the source suggested earlier?
The sources confirmed the Punjab plane stunt was real, involving the low numbers we discussed, fewer than 20 people, and again, primarily undocumented individuals. But the sources emphasized that the optics were undeniable.
The message.
Exactly. The handcuffs, the military aircraft, it wasn't about the scale of the deportation itself. It was entirely about sending a very clear, very harsh message. America's not your playground anymore.
So, putting it all together, what's the source's overall verdict after looking at the facts behind the claims? What's the takeaway?
The source concludes that the general crackdown and the tougher visa climate are absolutely real, and they're impacting people significantly. However, the specific justifications centered around spy talk and anti-Semitism feel, according to the source, like a smokescreen designed to justify the actions.
Okay.
The policy, in their analysis, seems driven more by a desire to play to a political base that wants left immigration, full stop. The data supports the reality of a tougher visa process, but the specific spy hysteria, as the source calls it, doesn't hold water.
And this brings us back to that bigger picture we touched on. The source material argues this isn't just about student visas, it's part of something much, much larger, targeting legal immigration pathways more broadly.
That's absolutely the conclusion drawn in the sources. This student visa crackdown is seen as just one piece of a larger strategy to reshape immigration. And it's particularly targeting legal pathways like H-1B visas.
The ones we mentioned earlier.
Precisely. We saw that Statistic Indians held a dominant 72% of those H-1B visas in 2023, making them crucial to tech hubs like Silicon Valley. They're really powering a lot of that innovation.
Which sets up that contrast the source highlights. Some viewing this pipeline of students becoming skilled workers via H-1B as essentially a loophole.
While critics, highlighted in the sources, argue that these are the very immigrants who are paying taxes, boosting innovation, and providing massive economic fuel for the country. It's a fundamental disagreement on the value of this flow.
And what tools are being used to restrict this flow, according to the sources?
The source material lays out the specific tools being employed. Visa revocations, making work permits much stricter, and increasing the threat of deportation even for minor issues. It creates a climate of fear.
And you can see the effect of this on students, right? It's not just theoretical fear.
Not at all. The sources cite data showing student concern levels skyrocketing. We mentioned that 55% of Indian students in the U.S. reported being very concerned about their visa status in 2025. That's a massive jump from 30% just 2 years earlier in 2023.
Wow, that's a huge increase in anxiety.
It is. The sources even mention anecdotal evidence of students self-deporting, choosing to leave the country on their own terms rather than wait for a potential forced removal or deal with the stress.
And the source directly links this to the political climate.
They see the administration is riding a significant wave of anti-immigrant sentiment. Supporters might frame this crackdown as a return to America first, but the critics, according to the sources, argue that the U.S. is actively killing its edge.
Killing its edge. How so?
The question posed in the sources is stark. Who's going to code the next ChatGPT if you deport the coders? It points to the potential long-term damage to innovation and the economy.
Let's step away from the statistics and policies for a moment and really focus on the human element, the individual stories that our source material brought to light. These really hit home.
They really do. The sources we reviewed share a couple of incredibly powerful examples that really drive home the impact beyond the numbers. There's Priya, a 22-year-old from Bengaluru. She did everything right. Got accepted into UC Berkeley for computer science.
Top school.
Top school. Incredibly competitive, incredibly expensive, costing around $50,000 a year in tuition. Her family made a huge leap of faith, taking out a loan against their home to cover it.
Oh, man.
But last month, her F1 visa, that's the standard student visa, was simply denied. No real reason given, just denied.
And now she's just stuck after all that.
Stuck. Her dream is on hold. Her family is left scrambling, burdened by that loan, with no clear path forward. The sources include a quote from her. It's just heartbreaking. I thought America wanted talent. Now I feel like they just want my money.
That is just devastating. And what about Arjun's story? That sounded worrying, too.
Arjun is a grad student down in Texas. He was deep into writing his thesis when he suddenly got notice that his visa was under review. The reason given: he had attended a campus protest.
A protest?
Yeah. And the sources note this was a protest about Gaza, not related to any espionage claims. Now, he's described as living in this constant state of paranoia, scared to even post on Instagram, constantly worrying, what if they deport me for a meme?
Just for attending a protest, that creates such a chilling effect.
Exactly. And the source material makes it clear these aren't just isolated, one-off cases, right?
No, they emphasize that these are representative of a much wider phenomenon. Families across India are genuinely rethinking their entire futures. Travel agents in places like Punjab, which has a long history of people migrating to the U.S., are reportedly pivoting their business entirely towards Canada and Australia.
Really shifting focus.
Yeah. The sources even mention churches in Kerala holding special prayer sessions for students caught in this unbearable visa limbo.
Wow. It's affecting communities deeply.
The source's summary of this human impact is pretty sobering.
It says that the American dream, while still alive as a concept for many, now effectively has a "do not enter" sign slapped firmly on it.
This situation also has a broader global ripple effect, and it particularly impacts India's standing on the world stage, according to the analysis we looked at.
It absolutely does. The sources highlight that India already faces a challenge with a significant number of its citizens living undocumented in the U.S. The number cited was 725,000 as of 2022. That's a large number.
Yeah.
This U.S. crackdown, especially the focus on busting Indian travel agencies accused of facilitating illegal crossings and charging exorbitant sums like 20 to 50 lakh for illicit passages, which, for context, is roughly equivalent to 20 to 50,000 U.S. dollars.
That's a fortune for many families.
A huge fortune. It puts a real spotlight on this issue of illegal migration pathways originating from India.
And India's government is reportedly trying to address this.
The sources indicate India is cracking down internally, mentioning that 50 such agencies were busted in 2024. However, the sources also acknowledge that the problem is deep-rooted, citing issues like corruption, lax oversight, and the underlying desperation that drives people to seek these dangerous illegal routes in the first place.
So what's the consequence of all this for India's global image?
The sources suggest India's international reputation is taking a hit. While often pitched as a rising tech and economic superpower, it's now, according to the analysis, also being tagged as a hub for illegal migration.
Ouch.
The sources describe this as stinging for India, especially when it's trying so hard to project an image of a responsible global leader.
And those deportations, like the Punjab incident, are they causing diplomatic strain between the U.S. and India?
Yes,
Yep.
India has expressed concerns and a desire for more humane treatment of its citizens being deported, wanting to avoid things like handcuffs and the public spectacle of military planes, basic dignity.
Sure.
But the analysis we saw suggests the U.S. administration is currently playing hardball on immigration and isn't prioritizing diplomatic sensitivities on this issue.
So looking ahead, what options do the sources suggest are available both for India as a country and for individual students caught in this uncertainty? Where do people go from here?
For India, the sources recommend several strategic steps. Cracking down even harder on those rogue travel agents with stricter laws and more effective enforcement, continuing to push diplomatically for better treatment of its citizens who are being deported.
Right.
And, crucially, diversifying pathways. If the U.S. door is becoming unreliable, India could proactively negotiate more favorable education and migration agreements with other popular destinations like Canada, Australia, and countries in Europe. Don't put all the eggs in one basket, essentially.
Makes sense. And for the students themselves, what's the advice coming from the sources? What should they be thinking?
The strong advice is to develop a solid Plan B. Canada's universities are presented as excellent alternatives with a generally more predictable immigration system. Australia has a growing tech sector, and countries like Germany even offer free tuition at public universities.
So other attractive options exist.
They do. The sources acknowledge that none of these might feel exactly like that original dream of Silicon Valley, but they offer tangible pathways that are certainly preferable to facing deportation or endless uncertainty. For those still determined to aim for the U.S., the advice is to prep harder.
Meaning?
Meaning nail every detail of the visa interview, be extremely cautious, and ideally avoid any form of protest activity, and be hyper-aware of your social media presence. Basically, don't give them any excuse.
Be squeaky clean.
Pretty much.
And there's a significant irony in all of this, according to the sources we looked at, right? A potential downside for the U.S. itself.
One major, perhaps self-defeating irony. The sources argue that this crackdown might spectacularly backfire on the U.S. By actively making it harder for talented students and potential immigrants to come, the U.S. risks pushing away the very people who drive innovation, start companies, and pay vast amounts in taxes.
Like those Silicon Valley founders.
Exactly. The sources point out that immigrants from India, specifically, founded 20% of Silicon Valley startups in 2023. If this pool of talent feels unwelcome or blocked, other countries, Canada, Germany, Australia, will, as the sources put it, happily scoop them up.
So the talent just goes elsewhere.
It does. The conclusion drawn is quite blunt. America first, more like America left behind.
And the source material doesn't shy away from highlighting the perceived hypocrisy either.
Not at all. It points out the irony that the very administration driving this crackdown has its own businesses that rely heavily on foreign workers. They specifically mention Mar-a-Lago being stuffed with H-2B visa holders.
H-2B, those are typically for non-agricultural seasonal workers, right? Hospitality, resorts.
That's right. So the sources find it deeply hypocritical that the kind of labor and talent that benefits the administration's own ventures is the same kind of individual being blocked or deported for others. They take in the sources. The hypocrisy is thicker than a New York pizza slice.
So pulling everything together from the source material we've explored today, the core findings are clear. These changes to U.S. visa policies are very real, and they are having a profound, often negative impact on people, particularly in countries like India.
Absolutely. The stated justifications for these changes, the claims of widespread campus espionage and anti-Semitism among students, are heavily questioned and largely unsupported by the analysis and data presented in the sources.
Right, the smokescreen argument.
Exactly. However, the concrete effects of the policy on visa approval rates, the pervasive fear it has created, and the human disruption are well documented in the material we reviewed. That part is undeniable.
The sources leave us with some pretty powerful concluding imagery, don't they? The American dream for many is depicted as being on a ventilator, and the U.S. itself feels less like that land of opportunity and more like, to use the source's words, a gated community.
It's a stark image. And the final thought offered in the sources for students around the world is a challenging one. Perhaps it's time to seriously rethink the dream and start looking more seriously towards places like Toronto, Berlin, or elsewhere.
Diversify the dream, perhaps.
Yeah. The message conveyed is that the idea of a free ticket to paradise is, for many, effectively canceled, and for some, it feels like the return flight's already booked.
It really makes you pause and consider the long-term consequences. Based on the source's analysis that the U.S. might be actively pushing away the very talent and innovation that has fueled its economic engine for decades, what does that potentially mean for its global standing and competitiveness down the line?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It is. And how does this shift redefine the global landscape of aspiration and opportunity for talented individuals everywhere? It's certainly a lot to think about long after our deep dive today.